Welcome to the School of Psych, Episode 1, Exploring Stockholm Syndrome. My name is Charlotte Clausen, and I will be your hostess today. This podcast is being recorded on March 16th, 2017. So, in today's episode, we will be discussing Stockholm Syndrome. So, Stockholm Syndrome is formally defined as a feeling of trust or affection felt by a victim towards a captor in hostage takings or kidnappings. So, Stockholm Syndrome can actually be linked back to our most ancient ancestors. So, specifically in this kind of time period, women were constantly facing the issue of being taken by other tribes or groups of people. So, obviously, when they got into this very threatening situation where they felt like either they were in danger or their kids were in danger, they often developed this kind of bond with the tribe or the leader or whoever it was, a religious group. So, they felt like they had a sense of security and that their lives wouldn't be at risk. So essentially, Stockholm Syndrome is kind of like a self-defense survival mechanism used by the victim to protect oneself from the stress and the fear they're feeling from the situation at hand. Just like these women did, they developed these bonds so they felt like they had a better chance of survival because they were so afraid of what could happen to them. So essentially, that is my core argument when it comes to Stockholm Syndrome. I believe that it is the direct result of man's need to self-preserve in difficult situations. However, every case is very, very different, and there are many different ways in which one can preserve themselves. So throughout this podcast, I'm going to be discussing the many ways in which victims use Stockholm Syndrome as a way to self-preserve. I'm going to try and explain why they do that specific method along with the science and context behind their actions. So I'm going to start off with an article from the database Science and Context, where the author discusses victim JC, who suffered pretty severely from Stockholm Syndrome. So in the article, the author discusses why JC didn't run away from her abuser. And the author discusses how JC might have made herself believe that nobody loved her or nobody was actually looking for her, like her family or the police. So this idea caused her to have these negative feelings towards her parents, or the police. Therefore, JC convinced herself that maybe her captor was the only one who was truly there for her, or he was the only one who truly loved her. So, as mentioned before, victims of Stockholm Syndrome use hatred towards the police for not finding them as a way to self-preserve. The victim believes the police aren't doing enough to find them, making them feel vulnerable and very helpless. So, these feelings of vulnerability and helplessness ultimately lead to a bond between the victim and the abuser. The victim becomes so helpless, it starts to feel like connecting with their abuser is the only option. They start to feel like they're the only ones there in their lives, and they're the only ones who want to be with them or care for them. So, another common way in which victims self-preserve is by blaming themselves for the problem at hand. They essentially convince themselves that if they approach or treat their abuser differently, maybe they won't be abused or the relationship won't be as dysfunctional. They start to deny the abuser's violent side and only focus on the positive side of the relationship. So, suddenly, it becomes harder and harder to separate as they start to depend on the bond, because the victim doesn't believe that the abuser is doing anything wrong. They solely blame themselves, and she starts to really emotionally depend on their abuser. So, according to the Health Reference Center, the victim starts to believe this is the only positive relationship available to them. This idea makes them feel so alone and helpless that they start to adopt the actual identity of the abuser, therefore adopting their set of beliefs, values, and habits. They start to learn what makes them happy or angry, and they eventually become brainwashed into being obsessed with pleasing their abuser. So, to bring up some other cases, Stockholm Syndrome also develops within relationships in cases of domestic violence. It's not only these kidnapping hostage-like situations. In a TED Talk done by Leslie Morgan, she talks about why women stay in these abusive relationships. She has a pretty powerful quote that I'm going to say now. She says, "I didn't know he was abusing me, even though he held those loaded guns to my head, pushed me down the stairs, threatened to kill our dog, pulled the key out of the car ignition as I drove down the highway, poured coffee grinds down my head as I dressed for a job interview. I never once thought of myself as a battered wife. Instead, I was a very strong woman in love with a troubled man, and I was the only person on earth who could help him face his demons." So as you can see, Leslie developed quite an interesting case of Stockholm Syndrome. She put up with all the abuse because she brainwashed herself into believing that being with him was the only option. I feel like Leslie kind of blamed herself for the abuse her partner was giving her. She denied all the negative, awful things that he was doing to her, and she only focused on the positive or the future of the situation. She basically put up with it because it became an expected routine, and she got so caught up with it that she didn't realize the things that were going on were not okay, and she didn't realize the actual root of the problems. So after discussing all the ways in which victims self-preserve, I want to talk about why they do this and the true motives behind their actions. So in an article by Billy Adams in the database ProQuest 5000, he talks about how when people are put in situations like this, regardless of their individual age, they use their earliest premature thoughts in order to preserve themselves. They become very, very reliant on their captor because they feel like they're the only thing they have left, and they're the only person there to look after them, protect them, etc. So this idea is very, very similar to how a baby relies on his mother for everything. The baby relies on his mother for food, shelter, emotional needs, etc. So the dysfunctional bond formed between the victim and the captor is used to preserve the emotional needs of the victim. So in a different article by Celia Jameson in the Journal for Cultural Research, which I accessed on the database EBSCOhost, Jameson discusses how a bond between the captor and the victim are sometimes inevitable. It comes as this natural instinct to bond with the abuser because the victim starts to lose control of their ability to think and form rational opinions for themselves. Therefore, they resort to their natural instincts, which we discussed before as having that reliance on another person for their emotional needs. So to finish off this podcast, I wanted to discuss an analogy that I found very interesting. I found it in an article by Elena Doctorman in a Times magazine. So Malkin basically compares a captor-aggressor relationship to a gambling addiction. She says how the captor uses the good memories as a way to distract their brain from the bad memories. They use the possibility of a good moment to forget about the bad moment. So to relate this back to gambling, which is our key analogy here, when people are gambling, they always stay in the game because they have faith they will have a good hand next or get more money, etc. They forget about the bad hand and they move on. The player uses this as a way to survive in the game because they're staying positive and having faith, which is just like what the victims are doing. The poker players, or the gamblers, say they will change the way they are playing in order to better the results, just like how victims change their behavior to please their aggressors. So I think this is a really powerful analogy that kind of just links together all these concepts about Stockholm Syndrome, and it's definitely something to keep in mind. So that is all I have for you for today. I hope you enjoyed this podcast and definitely learned some interesting facts and motives behind Stockholm Syndrome. And yeah, hope you enjoyed. Thank you.